On today's show, I have Jeffrey Sass. He may not be as big of a household name as Troma Studios, but I think after you talk to him, you'll learn how integral he was to a lot of their productions back in the 90s and beyond, and how he still stays in touch with Lloyd Kaufman, who wrote the foreword to his book, which is so cleverly titled Marketing 101. Everything I know about business and marketing, I learned from the Toxic Avenger. Welcome to the show, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Kelly. Everyone should have a business mentor. In my case, my mentor was a monster, literally a hideously deformed creature of superhuman size and strength.
Well, I can tell you're a good marketer already because you wrote a really good subtitle.
One Man's Journey to Hell's Kitchen and Back.
Well, and what we're going to talk about today is how Troma Studios was a big influence and it's, a proving ground for you, but also how, what a lot of people would consider an exploitation movie studio, even, a little bit raw and out there, kind of help groom you for success in the more refined business world, doing marketing, and I would even say you becoming a serial entrepreneur.
That's correct. This crazy experience on the west side of Manhattan in a little village called Tromaville proved to provide lessons that have lasted me, throughout my career. And here it is. I was at Troma for 7.5 years from 1987 to 1994. So we're talking, 25 years ago. And yet things that I experienced then and lessons I learned from Lloyd and Toxie himself are things that I find myself applying to, business all the time to this day. So it proved to be a very valuable education for me.
Well, before we get into more particulars, I'm really curious what your background was before you went to Troma, and did it include film? I mean, was your dream to become a film director?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I went to college. I graduated from Cornell University, and I studied English, theater arts, and creative writing, and did fancy myself as someone who wanted to get into the entertainment industry. And when I left college, I started working at a small independent distribution company in New York called Satori Entertainment. And at Satori, we were basically the leading importer of English language foreign films. So films from Australia, New Zealand, and Great Britain. We would go and find these movies and get the distribution rights for the US for those films. And we would bring them in. Early films from, Bruce Beresford and Roger Donaldson and Tim, which was Mel Gibson's first film with Piper Laurie. So these are all films that we would get the U.S. rights to and distribute them in the U.S. in theaters and also a lot in pay television. This was in the early days when HBO and Showtime were just starting out and just beginning to license movies. And we were licensing movies to them and to the over-the-air pay TV services, which is something that no longer really exists.
Right. And one thing I'll add before you move on is it was these distribution companies that had this unlikely pairing of like a company that might be doing foreign films would also be doing like exploitation and underground and indie film. Is this odd marriage of very classy films and very trashy films by the same distributor.
Well, because they were all independent films back at that time. I mean, anything that was kind of outside the studio circle and being booked directly into the art houses, fell into, in many times, both of those categories. And some of those art houses would play, the subtitled classics by day, and then at night they'd have, some of the independent horror films and some of the other, more exploitive or experimental films.
Classy by day, grindhouse by night.
Exactly.
Well, that's pretty cool because in distribution you do learn a lot of practical things of, I think you learn how ruthless people are where, oh, we don't even want to watch your movie. Let's see your artwork or your title or just, what's your hook? Learning so many movies are sold off of not even their content.
Absolutely, especially back then, because it was harder to make to make stuff than it is today in some respects. So many films were sold based on a one sheet and a trailer, and sometimes just a one sheet and the title was good enough. And a one sheet is, a flyer or a poster with some key art for the film. And you'd go to these international film festivals like the Cannes Film Festival and MIFED in Milan, and you'd be hawking your wares to buyers from all over the world, oftentimes before even a script was finished or anything had been shot.
Now, where was Satori based? What city?
So we were in New York. Satori was based in New York, actually not too far from Tromaville. We were on 42nd Street in between 8th and 9th Avenue, actually in the old McGraw-Hill building, right above Port Authority bus terminal.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
So this was, the 80s in New York. This is before the big cleanup. It was a little bit of a rougher city back then.
Yeah, it was a little bit rough. The bus station was always interesting. But the neighborhood, it was on the cusp of kind of starting to turn the corner. The theater district was reviving itself. There was some great off-Broadway theaters that far west, and Troma was on 49th and between 49th and 50th on 9th Avenue. And I actually had come across Lloyd and Michael, in Troma, as I was working for Satori, and originally approached them hoping to get the syndication rights or the TV rights to Troma's library for Satori to handle, because we were expanding beyond just pay TV and theaters at that point, and starting to put some of the movies that Satori represented into TV syndication. And I thought that Troma movies could potentially be added to that library for us, and that's what prompted me to call on them.
Well, it sounds like it's something that, a classy distributor of foreign films, Troma, may not even been on their radar. I mean, was it you that recognized and said, hey, don't overlook this smaller, company, or that you might think is just exploitation? Did you have to sell them on the fact that Troma had a pretty, large potential audience?
I think that at that point in time, we were really looking for volume, and they were a local company. The TOXIC Avenger had already been released at that time and was starting to get a bit of a following, and I knew that they had a large library of films that I thought maybe we could do something with. So I was just really trying to talk to as many potential sources of content as I could, and Lloyd and Michael were on my radar, and they were only a short walk from our office. So I figured I would reach out to them and set up a meeting, which I did. And it was unsuccessful for Satori, but I guess arguably successful for me.
Right. And you talk about that in your book a little bit.
Yeah, I kind of go through at the very beginning, just sort of the history of what got me to Troma in the first place, and that was really this whole meeting. So I originally set up a meeting with Lloyd and Michael in the Troma building to talk to them about Satori and pitch them on having us distribute their movies to TV syndication, and they had no interest whatsoever, zero, which is in the Troma way, because if Troma was going to do anything, they would rather do it themselves. So they had zero interest, but for whatever reason, the three of us kind of hit it off, Lloyd, Michael, and myself, and we kind of had fun talking, and I enjoyed my visit. And during a tour of the building, Lloyd took me around, and the Troma building at the time, they've since moved to Long Island City, but back then, the original Troma building on 9th Avenue was a 4-story walk-up brownstone, in Hell's Kitchen. And on the 4th floor were the editing suites. And again, back then, editing suites were, flatbed film editing, where you literally cut and spliced film together. And Lloyd took me up to the editing rooms, giving me a tour of the office. And at the time, they were cutting a new trailer for the TOXIC Avenger. The movie had been already out, but they were cutting a new trailer for it. And he showed me the new trailer and asked me what I thought. And to be honest, it was pretty dry and pretty bland and pretty straightforward. And at that point, I'm not sure if I had actually seen the TOXIC Avenger, but I knew of it. And I knew that part of its appeal was that not only was it gory and kind of out there, but it was also funny. So it was a gory superhero movie that had some humor behind it. But this trailer was very, very dry and straightforward. I think the tagline in the trailer was "a different kind of hero." And I kind of said to Lloyd, well, it's okay, but it's kind of drab. And I thought the TOXIC Avenger had some humor to it. And he said, well, it does. He said, well, he says, well, what would you say? What would you do? So I thought about it for a moment, and I said, well, the Toxic Avenger is from New Jersey, isn't he? And Lloyd said, yes, of course. And he's from, Jersey City, New Jersey. And I said, well, why not call it the first superhero from New Jersey, which gives it a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek taste to it and sort of a sense of that humor because of, especially back then, New Jersey was considered the armpit of America, and people in New York were always making fun of New Jersey. And so that idea of the first superhero from New Jersey, gave you a sense that this movie, was a little bit different. And Lloyd says, "Oh, I like that. I like that. Can we use it? Can we use it?" And I said, "Sure." And
So that shows you, well, even then you were branding, you were marketing. I mean, you had that sense, even with a movie like Toxic Avenger, there was some, thought put into the marketing.
Yeah, that kind of stuff and taglines and those kinds of things. It's either a blessing or a curse, but they come to me very quickly and very easily.
I mean, were you already good at that from your distribution days, or is that something that was just kind of coming to the surface when you went to Troma?
I think it was already there, and I think that at Troma over the years and in the years since, I've had the opportunity to hone it and exercise it further. But I think those kinds of puns and quick witticisms and wordsmithing was something that I've always enjoyed and has always been easy for me.
People who have such a nostalgia for VHS and home video of the 80s and cult film and classic horror film and all this, wasn't half the fun just the marketing and the crazy taglines that you would make up?
Oh, absolutely. And again, the Troma experience, gave me more than ample opportunity to do that because, with Troma, to build that library, and very much like Satori, Troma understood that there's value in building up a library of content that can be distributed through the various different channels, whether it's in the theaters or back then home video, as it was emerging. So building that library of content was important. And of course, there were only so many movies Troma could actually produce themselves in a given year. So Troma began to very aggressively acquire distribution rights to films by other filmmakers. And oftentimes those films were not quite completed, or they were student films, or they were just, not really a Troma film, and then we had to Tromatize it. So many of those films came to us in one form, and we put them through the Troma machine, changed the titles, re-edited them a bit, added some effects, added some different wacky music and stuff, and they came out the other end of the Troma machine as a completely different movie. I remember like one in particular was a student film shot on 16 millimeter about the Civil War when we acquired it, and then that became The Curse of the Cannibal Confederates. There are numerous stories like that. So we had ample opportunity to come up with crazy titles and accompanying artwork and
well, tell me
trailers
if you
match.
agree with this, because from everything you've said, you didn't just distribute these people's films, you gave them a lot of education in film marketing. And, at the same time, and, a decade or so before, Roger Corman was the proving ground for making and producing films. It sounds like what you guys were doing at Troma was the marketing and distribution equivalent of that.
Yeah, that's a pretty good analogy. I mean, we did produce and make movies ourselves, but most of those were generated in-house. We did get involved in some filmmakers' productions while they were in production and help them finish it. But in many cases, yes, we were the distribution and marketing outlet. And there's a great story about one of the films, and there's a chapter on it in the book. That film is Redneck Zombies. And Redneck Zombies was actually the first feature-length film to be distributed, sort of mainstream, that had been shot entirely on video. And two young filmmakers, Perry Lunis and his partner Ed, were Troma fans, and they came from Maryland, and they set out to make a horror film in the style of Troma. And, really they were inspired by Troma. And they made this great film. Today it's considered a classic, Redneck Zombies. And their only mission in life was to have that film distributed and marketed by Troma. And literally one wintry morning when it was pretty cold out, I often was one of the first to arrive at the Troma buildings. I commuted in from Rockland County, and I show up at the building, and there are these two guys just literally sitting on the stoop in front of the building, bundled up in their winter jackets, half awake. And I just assumed they were homeless because the neighborhood was that wasn't so uncommon in Hell's Kitchen. And I kind of stepped over them because they're snoring and unlocked the door and go up into the Troma office. And then as people keep trickling in to work during the morning, they're saying, hey, these two guys are sitting on the stoop. And I go, they're still there? They were there, 2 hours ago. So I go back outside and ask them, what are you guys doing here? And they go, this is Troma, right? I go, yeah, this is Troma. Oh, is Lloyd here? And I says, well, he's here. He says, we want him to see our film. And these two guys have been hanging out literally on our stoop with the VHS tape, 3/4 inch U-matic tape, I should say, of their film that they shot. And they just showed up out of the blue, hoping to get to show it to Troma. So, I said, well, come on in out of the cold. And I brought him inside and let him sit in the lobby and told Lloyd that these two guys out of nowhere were here and they want to show us their film. And he said, well, just, whatever. And we let him sit there, and they sat there literally for hours and hours and hours and hours. And finally, they're still sitting there patiently. So we let them into the office and let them pop their movie into the video player in Lloyd's office. And it was brilliant. It was gory and disgusting and raw and everything a Troma movie back then should have been. And we loved the title, Redneck Zombies. They came up with that great title. And that was the beginning of a great relationship. And Troma went on to distribute that film. The film went on to become, in many ways, a classic. And Perry stayed, never went back to Maryland, literally stayed in New York and slept on the floor of the offices sometimes and became one of our key special effects people throughout the productions of Troma's War and Kabuki Man and Toxic Avenger 2 and 3 and pretty much many of the movies that I worked on while I was there. Perry was a key part of those films. So it was a great relationship that started on the stoops of the building.
That's one of my favorite parts of the book, and I think it also shows why Troma has so many dedicated fans, because that's like, the mythology of, any beginning filmmaker can put themselves in that picture thinking, wow, if I'm just determined enough, a company like Troma will take a chance on me.
And that's true. And they've taken a chance on a lot of people who've gone on to greater things. One of the things I wish I could take credit for, but I really can't, is when I left Troma in 1994, they hired a young kid to replace me, and that was James Gunn. So one could argue if I hadn't quit Troma, maybe James Gunn wouldn't have gotten his start.
Because another great story.
He credits Troma, yeah. But
and it shows you just how small showbiz is, really, and especially you being the thing I like to talk to people about is being in physical proximity. People now with the internet think you can do everything remotely, but especially back in the 80s and 90s. You really had to be there where the action was and deal with people face to face.
Absolutely. And the filmmaking process, was not so digital back then. Really the digital editing was literally just coming into play as I was leaving Troma. I think we played with our first Avid editor instead of the big flatbed machines right around the time I was leaving. So, things were just changing. But that back then, filmmaking really required a lot of people, a lot more perhaps than it does today with some of the digital and more capable equipment. You get, in your pocket, standard included with every smartphone sold today is the equivalent of what back then we would pay $500-600 an hour for in a studio, to get some editing time and audio editing and everything else that's kind of just built into our pockets these days. So the tools of the trade have changed dramatically and have been democratized, but getting attention and telling a great story is still going to be a challenge no matter how you create your film.
Well, before we move on, I would just like you to explain to the millennials listening, and I'm pro millennial. I don't millennial bash, but as a person who's old enough to be their father, to know that a lot of people just have no concept of what the pre-digital world was like. And I just want you to explain the bias against shot on video films, because nowadays this new generation thinks, oh, these are cool. The more low budget and glitchy, the better. There's even companies like, Bleeding Skull that have re-released a lot of very low budget shot on video movies from the 80s, which is great. I mean, I love watching that. But back then, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, it was almost impossible to sell your movie to a distributor if it was not shot on film.
Well, it's even bigger than that, Kelly. First of all, yes, you're absolutely right. It was not almost impossible. It was impossible.
Right.
If your film was shot on video, the only hope was that it would potentially go straight to video. There was no chance of a theatrical release, which would diminish its value in the video world back then. The technology to transfer from film to video back then was very, very, very primitive compared to today. And you could tell in an instant that you were watching something that had been transferred from film to video. It was generally blurry. There was lag in any action or moving scenes. Nothing was high definition as it is today. So that was the kiss of death. If you shot it on video, then it was going to be released on video. But it's more interesting than that when I look at just television today. Back then, in the early 80s, there was something called, broadcast quality. And literally, you could be fined for the things that are shown routinely now on mainstream media and the evening news when they do remote reports via YouTube and cell phone footage. Those things you would literally get fined for if you broadcast that kind of quality back in the 80s. Wow. That stuff was not allowed. That was substandard. You could not put that on air. So one of my first jobs at Satori was to actually supervise film to tape video transfers. So if we sold a movie to HBO, for example, that movie had to be transferred to videotape so it could be shown on TV. And that was a process where you had to go into a lab and reel by reel, it was projected and then recorded on video with special equipment, and you had to then go back and watch the edit point because it was all done manually. So literally when a reel changed, someone had to go 3, 2, 1 and push a button and hope that when they were combining the two reels on the videotape, there wasn't any sort of a glitch at the edit point. And after we laid down a reel of film, which was typically about 18 minutes long, we'd have to go back, rewind the videotape and look at the edit point. And probably 20% of the time, the edit messed up and there was an extra frame there or something was wrong, and we'd have to go back and lay down the whole 18-minute film reel again. So the attention to quality and detail back then was critical. And if it was flawed in any way, with a scratch on the negative of the film or a bad edit point, the network wouldn't accept it and they wouldn't air it. And today they're airing stuff that is, horrible by comparison. Things like jump cuts, which is now commonplace in interviews and everything else, that wasn't allowed. You couldn't cut from someone to the same person. You'd have to have a different angle. You'd have to have an insert or a cutaway. It was unacceptable to air a video that had jump cuts in it. And then MTV and music videos came along and made that somewhat of an artistic standard. So a lot has changed in that regard.
Definitely. Was back then what you would give the TV station like a Beta SP tape? Was it that era?
No, it was before that, actually. We were dealing with 1 and 2 inch. When I first started out, it was 2-inch videotape. These were gigantic machines, larger than a refrigerator. That was the 2-inch videotape recorder. Then it got smaller and it became 1 inch. And then from 1 inch, it went to 3/4 inch, which were the U-matic machines that people might remember seeing. And then VHS and Beta came to be.
Wow. And that equipment, like for TV news, those were big, heavy cameras.
Yes, big cameras, the ENG, electronic news gathering, they were referred to, and it was just huge cameras as compared to huge cameras that in many cases did not have the capability or quality as the camera on your phone today.
So how did you get Lloyd to greenlight Sergeant Kabuki NYPD?
So Kabuki Man was a fun project for us to do. It was a co-production with a Japanese company, and actually the Japanese.
And I just said Kabuki. You're right. Let me say the entire correct title.
Sure.
So I know I'll get flack. Sergeant Kabuki Man NYPD. I'll kick myself for mispronouncing that.
That is correct. Yeah, and Kabuki Man was kind of, the interesting story about Kabuki Man is it was a pseudo transition film for Troma because in the midst of my tenure in Tromaville, we took the Toxic Avenger character and turned him into a Saturday morning cartoon show. So we came up with the Toxic Crusaders, which back in 1990 was literally a Saturday morning cartoon, complete with toys, action figures, pajamas, video games, puzzles, children's books, coloring books, everything you could imagine, the complete, licensing works. We had over 70 licensees around the world making Toxic Crusaders products. So we had taken, which was a remarkable feat when you think about it, we took this character that was born in a very raw, very gory, very R-rated movie and turned him into a cartoon character that was suitable for children of all ages. And that was the Toxic Crusaders. And we enjoyed a lot of success with the Toxic Crusaders at the time and thought that, there was an opportunity to do more wacky characters aimed at children. So Kabuki Man as a project had already been in the works, but we started thinking perhaps that would be a great character also to be perhaps more G-rated than the old Troma movies would have been, because that Kabuki Man character could also be translated into toys and games and merchandise, etc. So we did sort of half and half. And as we shot the movie, we shot a version that was kind of more G-rated or PG-rated, and then we had also the R-rated footage available, and it's sort of come out half and half, a little bit of both. But it was a great project, and Lloyd and I collaborated on the script for that project. And there were a lot of funny stories in the book about how things that happened in real life ended up, in the movie and ended up in the script. There's one particular story when Lloyd and I were writing in his apartment in Manhattan. It was in the summertime, and the window was open, and all of a sudden a car alarm went off outside. And we looked out the window and saw someone, grabbing stuff from inside the broken window of a car and running down the street. And for whatever reason, we decided to be good citizens, and we ran downstairs and ran out the front door and started screaming down the street, "Stop thief," just like you see in the movies, and chased the guy to the corner. And but he got away, and we're huffing and puffing back to the office. And then we look at that car with the window smashed, and that sparked an idea for a running gag throughout the Kabuki Man movie, where there's a car parked on the street, and throughout the course of the movie, it keeps getting burglarized, and every time it's burglarized, a different sign goes up on the window, like those "No Baby on Board" signs. So the first time it's stolen, it's broken into, the thief leaves a "No Radio on Board" sign, and eventually by the end of the movie, there's signs that say like "No tires on board," "No engine on board." Everything's been stripped of this vehicle with those little yellow signs on the windows. So that gag,
very Troma.
yeah,
Very Troma, because the whole magic of Troma is that even if there is horror and weird stuff, there's almost always a good sense of humor in a Troma production.
absolutely. I think one of the things that, again, it's sort of a life lesson and a business lesson. We took the business of making movies seriously. In other words, when we were in production, it was a serious thing, and there were a lot of rules around safety and protecting people's property and treating everyone well. But we never took ourselves too seriously. We always understood that the art we were making was somewhat tongue-in-cheek and, not here to win awards or cure the ills of the world, but to entertain our fans. And we had many fans. And I think that kind of authenticity and the acknowledgement that we were in on the joke and that we weren't trying to pass off our films as anything more than they were, which is, entertainment, made a lot of people respect and like Troma in ways that others maybe weren't respected, who were making similarly low budget fare, but trying to present it as if it was, wonderful and great. And of course, we always thought our films were wonderful and great, but understanding them for what they were. And I think that's a lesson in life, especially for startups and entrepreneurs. There are many tech startup entrepreneurs who, go out there claiming they're going to change the world and they're going to do this and do that. And the reality is, they're just, making another widget. And if you're not curing cancer and doing things that really are going to change the world, that's okay. You're still creating jobs, you're still contributing to society, but be aware of what you really are and what you're really doing and what your real purpose is, and be authentic about it. I think that was a really great lesson from Troma, because, as wacky as we were, and you can have your own opinion about the quality of the films, but we were always true to it and authentic about it, and still are to this day. It's part of the reason Lloyd and Michael and Troma have existed for 45 years.
Right, and I think also they were trendsetters in a lot of things. They're probably a little more modest about it, but say when you think of, co-producing, with a Japanese production company or investors, or, nowadays it's just a given, getting foreign money to help with a Hollywood production, or especially like your replacement, James Gunn, I'm sure knows very well, is making your movie appeal to people throughout the world, and then they say with action films, that's easier to translate in other countries. Now China is such a big consumer of Hollywood films. Do you think that back when you were making Sergeant Kabuki Man, that you were one of the early people to think, yeah, we need to make films that will appeal to people outside of the US?
Well, I think in back then, especially in the 80s, in the independent film world, not just Troma, but the independent film world in general, was very cognizant of creating something that had more of a global appeal, because that is how the funding was typically put together. In other words, no one market could necessarily provide enough money to make the film in its entirety, and the U.S. Distribution rights or the U.S. home video rights weren't enough to support the full budget of the film. So oftentimes, independent films were pieced together. The financing was pieced together from various territories pre-buying the film, and adding up all those pre-sales from the different international markets gave the filmmakers enough money to go ahead and make the film. So I think that was something that was very important throughout independent filmmaking back then. And certainly in the case of Troma and doing Kabuki Man as a Japanese-American co-production, that was definitely something important and groundbreaking to us, and it helped get the movie made. Parts of it and parts of Toxic Avenger Part 2 were filmed in Tokyo, which was very cool. And so that global perspective was definitely very important. And Troma has fans all over the world. In Japan, the Toxic Avenger is referred to as Doku Doku Monster, which I understand means like wild and crazy monster. And so it became such a brand that when Class of Nukem High came out, that became Doku Doku High School. And so like that Doku Doku nomenclature became kind of a little bit of the Troma brand in Japan.
But when you look at the Toxic Avenger, it doesn't take a lot of, intellectual effort to just get what this character is. I think people of all ages and from around the world can see the Toxic Avenger and just instantly get it.
Yes, you can look in the mirror and see how you too could look like a hideously deformed creature of superhuman size and strength if you were to be pushed into a vat of toxic chemicals.
Well, along those lines, another part of the book I really like, the power of having a character that wears a mask or some, heavy special effects makeup, so that if the actor playing him pisses you off, it's really seamless and easy to replace him.
Yes, I think there's a chapter in the book, and it's called "Everyone is Replaceable, Especially If You Wear a Mask." And again, this is based on what you just described, but it's a lesson for anyone in business. I think it's important. People sometimes our egos get ahead of us, and we forget that no matter how important we think we are to our company, to our associations, whatever, we're replaceable, all of us at every level. And this in business is more true today than ever before. I'm old enough to have grown up in a world where my grandfather, worked for the same company for his entire career for over 50 years. That doesn't happen so much anymore, right? At every level now, even at the CEO level, no one's job is really secure. No one's tenure at a company is typically more than, 5 years, 7 years is a long time to be at a company now, whereas back then it was understood that you went to work somewhere and you'd stay there forever. So everyone is replaceable, everyone is expendable, and especially if you wear a mask. So in these superhero stories where the actor or actress playing a role is completely behind a mask. That's great for the filmmakers because it means we can be filming multiple scenes with that actor at the same time. So while the main Toxic Avenger could be doing dialogue in one location, we can have a stunt Toxic Avenger out with the second unit shooting stunts at the same time. All they needed was the costume and mask. So it became very efficient and cost effective. But it also meant that if the actor's ego did get carried away, it was fairly easy to replace them. And during the filming of Toxic Avenger 2 and 3, and as a side note, I should digress for a moment. You talked about things that Troma sort of pioneered. Toxic Avenger 2 and 3 was originally one movie. It was going to be one script for one film, Toxic Avenger Part 2. But we shot so much footage, and the story became so involved that we had the ideas. Let's just edit it into 2 films and do 2 sequels at once. And at the time, that was kind of a new concept, which since then, many films now have gone out and, and shot several of the sequels at the same time, obviously leveraging the economies of scale and the locations and the actors and just going out and shooting Part 2 and Part 3 simultaneously. And I think we were one of the first to ever do that. Excuse me?
Didn't Twilight do that with... or taking like what would have been the last book in this series and say, oh, we're going to make 2 sequels out of that.
Yeah, it's happened quite a bit. Since then.
And that is where I think the people who love Troma and their fans, you make it so seamless they don't realize all the thought and business savvy to make these freewheeling, exploitation style movies. There's a lot of good business sense behind this.
Absolutely, and shooting a lot of film too it's expensive, right? The film, unlike what we deal with today, where you virtually have unlimited capability with digital. Back then, if you're shooting in 35 millimeter, the film itself is expensive. The processing is even more expensive, and if you shoot 100,000 feet of film, you want to use 90,000 of it if you can, right? Because you don't want to waste what you've done, and so that became 2 films. And back to the Expendable, just to finish up the Expendable story. So if you look at Toxic Avenger Part 2 and Part 3 carefully, you'll notice that in some scenes, the Toxic Avenger might be a little bit shorter and a little bit stockier. And in other scenes, he's a little bit thinner and a little bit taller. And the arms are not quite the same. And that's because along the way, we decided to part ways with one of the actors playing the Toxic Avenger, and one of the backup Toxies sort of stepped in and became the lead Toxies. So if you look carefully, you can tell. But anyway, everyone is expendable.
Well, maybe you could play a drinking game with that. Watch those 2 back to back, and every time the actor changes, take another shot.
That would be a good game, especially if you're interested in getting drunk really fast.
Well, I have to ask you a little bit more about Toxic Crusaders, because that has a cult following, and that's such a great story in the book too. But this was also at the time where I think a lot of people don't realize Saturday morning cartoons went through a lot of changes, because at first I think there were even laws about, you can't use these cartoons to just blatantly market to children. And then I think some of those restrictions came off, and suddenly you saw this avalanche of cartoons that were developed as the toy first, then the cartoon really promoted the toy.
Yeah, you had a lot of that controversy, and there were things like, I think the Thundercats was one in particular that got a lot of criticism for being literally toy first and then a cartoon. And to combat that, one of the things that was interesting about the Toxic Crusaders is we really emphasized the environmental message, because Toxie was the result of a toxic chemical mishap. He really became a crusader for the environment, and all the other characters that we created to go along with Toxie in the cartoon series all had a environmental, a positive environmental side of them. So one of the characters was Nozone, who had been affected by the deterioration of the ozone layer and had this big blue nose, and there was Major Disaster, who was kind of a plant-based hero. And so all of these characters we created for the Toxic Crusaders had this, pro-environmental story behind them, and the storylines of many of the episodes were, pro-environment and that kind of thing. Captain Planet was doing similar things around the same time. So that was kind of a theme in trying to bring some positive message into these cartoons that still had tons of toys and games and merchandise behind them.
Well, you were mentioning some of the merchandise created for Toxic Crusaders. What is some of the most collectible of all of that now?
Well, the original action figures that were made by Playmates Toys, especially if they're in their original packaging, are definitely very collectible. There's some newer action figures that have just been released since then, but those original ones were great. I mean, I think any of the original Toxic Crusaders products were a lot of fun. We, as I mentioned before, had about 70 companies worldwide who were making Toxic Crusaders products. And there's a chapter in the book about this idea of too, especially when you're a startup, raising your own hand and taking on new opportunities, even if you don't know what you're doing. At the time we were doing the Toxic Crusaders, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were already a huge success, and there were many in the industry that thought that the Toxic Crusaders had the opportunity to kind of become the next Ninja Turtles. So we had everyone approaching us, wanting to handle the licensing merchandising for us. Everyone in the industry, literally, from the people who literally were handling it for the Mutant Turtles, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, to all these major toy companies wanting to take it over and do it for us. And they all would come by and meet with us, and people were literally whining and dining Troma. It was kind of funny because it wasn't anything we were particularly used to. In one case, someone came in and literally handed us a check for, it was either $25,000 or $50,000, which was for us at Troma back then quite a bit of money, and just handed us a check, no contract, no nothing. Here's an advance against the rights. Don't worry about it, and it was that kind of thing. People literally throwing money at us, and they all wanted the same thing, and that was a third. They would take a third of whatever we made from the merchandising. That was kind of the standard fee. And after having all these meetings and having all this money thrown at us and everything else, we kind of scratched our heads. And I said to Lloyd and Michael, how hard can it be? Let's just do it ourselves and save that third. And I kind of raised my hand and said, I'll do it. I'll figure it out. And so we started Troma Licensing and went ahead and did all those deals directly ourselves. And the point being for the book is, sometimes in business and a startup, you need to, even if you're not sure how to do it, if an opportunity strikes, sometimes it's best to just raise your hand and go for it. And that might be an opportunity to take on more responsibilities within your company, as I did in that instance, or it might be for your company to go down a different path and launch a new product or go into a different area that you haven't been in before. Just because you haven't done it before doesn't mean you shouldn't take on that opportunity and try.
I promised we'd talk a little bit about your life and career beyond Troma, although I do want to come back and talk a little more Troma, but I think this is a good point to talk about how, your licensing background in Troma and marketing. Let's jump forward a decade or so to what you're doing now, and especially you are the Chief Marketing Officer for a company, paw.com, P-A-W as in a dog paw, with these amazing, dog products. How would you say, what you learned back in the Troma days that you're now using as a marketer for these other companies?
Well, I think that there's a number of things that I can relate to paw.com and also to another company, .club Domains, that I'm also CMO of. One of the key things, of course, is to be authentic, as I mentioned earlier, and it's really important to be authentic and respectful of who your audience is. And that's one of the reasons why Troma has lasted successfully all these years. Is Troma always understood and respects their fans and their audience. And I think with Paw, along those same lines, we want to recognize that the pet owner, our customer for the pet products that paw.com makes, our customer treats their pet as a member of their family. If they have a dog, that dog is a member of their family. And so we want to make sure that the stories that we tell and the way we present our products respects that fact that your pet is part of your family, and we try to create products that help you and your pet live together in your home, in a happy way. Things that are great for your pet, and they also look good in your home. And there's no such thing as a pet owner, right? You're the pet parent. You're part of family. So we don't own our kids, even though it feels like it sometimes. They're part of the family, and it's true for your pets as well. So I think understanding that those types of respecting your customers, respecting your audience, being authentic. Those are things that I try to bring through to any company I work with, including paw.com. Same with .club domains. I'm also the CMO of .club domains, which is one of the new domain name extensions. So instead of a web address that ends in .com or .biz or .org, you can get one that ends in .club, C-L-U-B. And again, a lot of the things, from Tromaville, seeded their way into the way we've marketed .club, including working with celebrities and some of that. When we launched .club, we did a whole big promotion with 50 Cent, because when you think of 50 Cent, you think of the song In the Club. And we thought that was a good way to get .club across. And so having the experience in the past of dealing with talent and dealing with celebrities and that kind of stuff was very helpful in bringing that concept to fruition.
Now you've, started some of your own companies, but you've also, since Troma, worked for other companies. I'm really curious, once you started meeting with other companies to work for them, and, on your resume comes up Troma, and especially going into more, let's say, more traditional or conventional companies, what was the response? Were people like, "Oh yeah, you did such a great job with Toxic Crusaders," or was it like this kind of uneasy, like, "Oh, Troma, what's this all about?" And what response did you get in other boardrooms?
Yeah, to be honest, at least not to my knowledge. I don't know what people say behind my back, but to my front, it's never been an affront. It's never actually been an issue. And obviously, I've written a book about it, so it's certainly no secret that I've spent 7 years in that world. And again, I think the authenticity of Troma. Even there's a chapter in the book. To be honest, if I'm honest with myself, as I try to be, I personally was not, and am not, a huge fan of those movies, meaning that if it was a Friday night back then I was going to sit down and watch a movie, a Troma movie probably wouldn't have been my first choice. Yet I had a long and fruitful 7+ year career making those films and marketing those films, not because I liked them, but because I loved the process of filmmaking, and I loved what we were doing and the whole machinery behind that process. But I also loved and respected our fans. And I understood that, even if what I was working on wasn't necessarily my cup of tea, I recognized that there were literally millions of people out there who loved what we were brewing. And I enjoyed and really became very passionate about serving them that tea, about, making the best damn Troma movie I could make. Not because I wanted to see it, because I wanted my fans, or the Troma fans, to see it and enjoy it, and to deliver something to them that they truly enjoyed. So, those are concepts that apply to any business, and I think there's nothing negative anyone can say about that. You don't have to be a fan of Troma movies to respect what they've done over 45 years in creating a brand and creating a successful business and a legacy in the film industry. So it's never really come up. And in fact, even while at Troma, and there's a chapter in the book about this too, one of the most remarkable things, probably close to the level of turning Toxic Avenger into a Saturday morning cartoon, but we became the licensing agent. Troma Licensing, the same company that was licensing the Toxic Crusaders, based on the Toxic Avenger, became the licensing agency for the Emmy Award-winning show on PBS, Reading Rainbow, the show with LeVar Burton, Reading Rainbow. And the fact that we were able to go to the public broadcasting companies that produced that show and convince the producers of Reading Rainbow to let the same company that put out the Toxic Avenger represent their pristine, educational, Emmy Award-winning brand is certainly a testament to us and to the fact that, it's business. And we did some great deals for Reading Rainbow. So it's all relative.
Well, it's really interesting too because I love Troma. So for me, no shame whatsoever. I would almost assume you'd get CEOs pulling you aside saying, "Well, I can't let my secretary know, but I love the talk."
And that type of thing happens. I do run into tons of people that I didn't realize, even knew who Troma was or the Toxic Avenger was, who say that. And then I run into a lot of people who actually never heard of Troma or the Toxic Avenger, but have also enjoyed reading my book and the lessons that are in the book, because they don't really, although they're built around that experience, there are lessons and things that would apply to truly any business.
Well, what do you think the lesson is for the low budget filmmaking companies, which very often are horror, exploitation, all the fun stuff? To me, those are the great ones. But to look back on the 80s and 90s when the home video boom hit and a lot of little companies sprang up overnight saying, we don't need Hollywood, we can shoot these, on a shoestring. But a lot of those are not around anymore. In fact, probably most of them aren't. So really give a little insight into why does Troma remain when really at their peak, there was a lot of competition out there. Is it just the Toxic Avenger? Is it just the good business practices? Why does Troma remain 40 years later and all these little startups don't?
Well, it's a great question. Probably Lloyd would have a good answer for it too. But I think, looking at it from my perspective, a couple of things. Number one, from day one, Lloyd and Michael created a situation where they could exist outside of the Hollywood system and answer to no one but each other, right? So Troma has never put itself in a position where it was, at the behest of a studio, of a particular distribution outlet, of a particular investor. Troma was always in a position to do what Troma thought it should do. And that helped it stay independent and fiercely independent all these years, where a lot of the companies you referred to, for financial reasons or otherwise, may have been gobbled up or merged with, or other companies, or were forced to give up because they didn't have that level of control. So Troma never gave up its control and set up a situation from day one where it could maintain that control. And a lot of that had to do with being very frugal. I mentioned it in the book. One of the smartest things Lloyd and Michael did in the early days, they had a few comedies that did very well at the box office, Squeeze Play and Waitress, and they took some of the proceeds of that and purchased the Troma building. So that building on the west side of Ninth Avenue, when they purchased it, was not very valuable, and they went ahead and bought the building outright. So they owned the Troma building, and that allowed them to operate very cost effectively because they weren't paying rent, and the ground floor had a retail space, and the revenue from the retail space pretty much paid for the real estate taxes on the building. So basically Troma existed rent free, and for a company up and coming, and when times are lean, that helps not to have the overhead of rent and things like that. So they made a lot of decisions along the way that enabled Troma to exist frugally when times were lean, and made smart decisions when times were not so lean. So I think that had a lot to do with it. And I think staying true to the brand. I think, to this day, Lloyd is Lloyd, Troma is Troma, and not much has changed over 45 years. They are who they are, and have always proudly acknowledged that. And I think people respect that level of authenticity. Even if you don't like what it is, you have to respect the sincerity and authenticity of it.
Well, you said the Lloyd name, which was going into my next question, because basically Lloyd is the face of Troma. People see Lloyd and Troma as, almost the same thing, which from a marketing perspective can be good or bad, just in that it's kind of like, Colonel Sanders, is or was Kentucky Fried Chicken. I think a lot of people like seeing a face to the business. Some companies don't need that, but when you become the face of it, you have to really go out there. And I think Lloyd's the type that goes to the horror conventions and the Comic Cons, and he's just out there tirelessly, or creating his, make your own damn movie series. And I think because of his effort, he keeps it fresh. It's like there's always something still new coming from him. I mean, do you think that's another reason why Troma's around, just because of just the sheer force of Lloyd Kaufman?
I think certainly Lloyd has a lot to do with it, and Lloyd's personality and perseverance and his innate marketing smarts and instincts for brand building absolutely contribute a great deal. But you'll also notice that Lloyd is rarely alone. When he makes those appearances, he's almost always accompanied by Toxie or Kabuki Man or both of them, and some element of the Troma team. And I think one of the things, again, that has made Troma last is that notion of the Troma team. I talk in the book about how when I was working there, there were literally rules where you could not say I. I did not exist in Tromaville. Well, technically, the letter I exists in the word Tromaville, but you were, as a Troma employee or an intern or a person in Tromaville, you were never to say I. Any of the correspondence we did outside of Troma was always number one, had to start with greetings from Tromaville. That was our universal salutation, greetings from Tromaville. And then it was always we. If I, Jeff Sass, was writing a letter to someone about a lunch meeting Tuesday, and it was just going to be the two of us, that letter would still say, greetings from Tromaville. We look forward to seeing you at lunch Tuesday. We will meet you at noon at the restaurant, blah, blah, blah. It was always we, never I. And that didn't matter if you were Lloyd or Michael, or if you were an unpaid intern. It was always we. You were always part of the Troma team. Even the logo and the credits on the films always say a Troma team production. The Troma team presents. It's always the Troma team. And I think that was very important. It was very important for building that sense of community. It's very important for making low paid and unpaid participants in the process feel like they were part of something and that they were appreciated. And I think that's gone a long way to Troma lasting this long as well, is that instillment of this notion of the Troma team.
I'm curious about the readers of your book. Because for me, from, say, a fan standpoint, you can read your book to get inside Troma stories. Whether or not you want the marketing side, you've got a lot of great stories about working at Troma, working with Lloyd and Michael. But the people who are reading this for the marketing wisdom that you have, what's been the response? Or what unlikely people do you say, wow, I didn't realize I could get all this good marketing advice from someone, from the film industry. Who are your readers of this book?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Kelly. And as it turns out, there's a lot of people who've read the book, and I've gotten feedback from, and a lot of the reviews that are posted on Amazon, 5-star reviews, they are from people who never heard of Troma, never heard of the TOXIC Avenger, never heard of Lloyd, and still enjoyed reading a business and marketing book that was wrapped around these anecdotal experiences. So it presented these lessons in a much more enjoyable, entertaining, and in many cases even funny way than they would have experienced in a typical business book. So the fact that it was Troma wasn't the draw for those folks, but it also helped them enjoy and benefit from the lessons more. So I've found that probably more people have read the book that didn't know Troma than have, believe it or not. But you're absolutely right. The Troma fan should thoroughly enjoy it because they'll get some great lessons, and you really get to look up underneath the kimono of Kabuki Man.
Well, it is the number one selling business and marketing book in Tromaville, New Jersey.
That's right, in Tromaville. It's funny because when I was doing that book cover, and it does say that, the number one best-selling business and marketing book, asterisk, and then the asterisk says in Tromaville, New Jersey. I have a good friend who is a actual New York Times best-selling author, and I showed him that book cover when it was, being created, and he took one look and he says, "What are you doing? You can't say that. You can't." And then he said, "Read the fine print." And then he paused, and then he read it, and then he started laughing, and he said, "Oh, okay." pretty funny.
Well, I think on your cover you practice what you preach because it's a great lesson in marketing. You got the great hook of the artwork of the Toxic Avenger, and even if you don't know who that is, it just grabs you. Great subtitle, forward by Lloyd Kaufman. I'm curious, have you ever done any consulting? Like, have they hired you to either design movie posters or book covers?
I do consult a number of companies on marketing, and I have done a presentation which I customize for businesses based on the book. So I do a presentation to businesses and tailor some of these stories specifically for the industry they're in. And then basically we'll come in and, everyone either gets at that time a copy of the book or has looked at it beforehand. And I've done that type of thing for a couple of companies and happy to do that more. It's a lot of fun. And it's not your typical business meeting for those involved. And there's also a marketing class at the University of Arkansas that actually uses the book and has for 4 semesters now as part of their marketing class, which is kind of fun too. And again, it's a situation where the students really love it because it's not the typical textbook, yet they get a lot out of it. So that's been a lot of fun.
Who would have thought? There must be a little Toxic Avenger pocket of fans in it.
Yeah, I think the professor who chose to do that did so for the reasons I just mentioned. I mean, normally these kids are handed, pretty dry textbooks, and it's hard to get their attention and keep their attention. And this is something that presents valuable lessons, but in a format that is atypical for a business book.
Do you think Lloyd will make any more Toxic Avenger sequels?
Well, the big news last year was that Legendary Pictures had obtained the rights to do a remake of the Toxic Avenger, a big budget remake. So I don't know the status of that, but if you Google it, there's a bunch of articles about it. And that's something that, Troma has always wanted to do. Even back when I was with the company, we had a few deals that almost came to fruition for a major studio to take on the Toxic Avenger as a big budget remake. So perhaps later this year we'll hear more about that, and that would, I think that Toxie as a character is something or someone or something or it or some monster that will live on forever. One of the interesting things about the Toxic Avenger and his legacy is I don't know that there are any other fictional characters that have gone through the broad iterations that Toxie has, meaning that a character that has been in an R-rated movie, in a PG-rated cartoon, in a Broadway musical, by the way, we didn't mention, but there's a very successful off-Broadway musical based on the Toxic Avenger that has been playing to rave reviews all over the world, literally. So Toxie's been on the stage of a musical, in R-rated, G-rated, cartoons, toys, games, animations. Even Mickey Mouse hasn't been in an R-rated movie. So I think Toxie is up there with one of the most widely spread characters ever.
Well, if they did make a remake, do you think he'd be battling global warming?
I don't know, and knowing how Hollywood works, that'll be entirely up to whoever gets hired. I actually think they've assigned the director and script writer to that project, or at least they announced someone back when this was announced last year. So I'm sure that they have their own ideas of which direction Toxie should head.
Can you imagine if Lloyd got a cameo with Greta Thunberg?
That would be pretty exciting. I'm pretty sure that Lloyd's a fan, and he does, get cameos in a lot of movies. He has a cameo in all of the Guardians of the Galaxy films that James Gunn did. He's got cameos in every one of the Rocky films because Lloyd, as many people may not know, one of his first experiences in filmmaking was as an associate producer and an assistant on Rocky, the original Rocky, with John Albertson and Sylvester Stallone. And he has since had a cameo in, I believe, every Rocky up until and including Rocky #6, which I think was the last one, although I may be out of touch with my Rocky regime.
That's impressive. I see. That's another reason to go back and watch those is to catch the Lloyd cameo.
Yeah, Lloyd also worked on the Final Countdown with Kirk Douglas and remained, right up until his recent passing, remained very good friends with Kirk Douglas and the Douglas family.
Well, we're going to wrap up in a little bit. Not quite yet, but I want to make sure that people know where to find you online. So we'll take a short commercial break here. And Jeffrey Sass, where's the best place for people to find you? And I mean, you've got several businesses, so why do you name them all? Where can we find, the classic Jeffrey, the book, your new businesses, thepod.com, the works?
Sure. I'll start with the easy stuff. So if you're interested in .club and .club domains, go to www.get.club, and that's get period CLUB. Paw.com, just like it sounds, paw.com, Paw. Great products there if you have dogs. And then for me, you can go to jeffreysass.com, and that's just kind of my main website. The book has a website at everythingiknowabout.marketing. And I'll mention, as I mentioned, the .club is one of the new domain extensions. There's also a .marketing. So a little bit of a marketing hack you can do is use a clever domain name as a redirect to something you're trying to get traffic to. So for example, I want you to go to my book on Amazon and buy the book. But if I tell you to go to Amazon.com and search for my name or search for the book's title, maybe you'll get it wrong. Maybe you'll see search results with some other book that'll catch your attention instead of mine. So instead, to get you right to my page, I registered the domain name toxicavenger.marketing, since it's tied in with the title of the book. So if you go to www.toxicavenger.marketing, that will take you directly to my books page on Amazon, one click away from buying the book. So that's a clever shortcut hack you can do with a relevant domain name. And with all the new extensions like .club and like .marketing, it's very easy to find one that fits just right, for what you're trying to do. You can find me on Twitter at Sass, S-A-S-S. And I think that's probably enough. You can Google me too.
Are you ever going to create a .toxic Avenger?
Right now, the opportunity to do so doesn't exist. I can close that window, but technically one could have done that, but that's kind of long for an extension. I don't know what the use cases would be, and that would be up to Lloyd. As the copyright holder of that name, that would probably be up to Lloyd to decide.
How about like .troma for like a vanity URL?
Well, you can do that. So when we launched .club, we were able to do so because ICANN, the organization that operates the domain namespace, opened up the opportunity for anyone to apply for anything. So you could have applied for .kelly. Troma could have applied for .troma. Many brands did apply for their name. So there's a .sony and a .bmw and a .canon. So many of these brands do have their name. But that window of opportunity to apply closed in January of 2012. There's going to be another round, but the dates haven't been announced yet. But sometime in the next year or two, there will be an opportunity for brands and others to go out and apply for their own name as a top-level domain again.
Do you think the price is going way up?
Hard to say how they'll handle it. When we did it for .club back in 2012, the application fee was $185,000.
What?
Yes.
$85,000?
Well, that was the application fee. We ended up being in contention with two other companies who also applied. And eventually, after negotiating for over a year, we went to an auction and we ended up winning the name in the auction for many times that application fee.
So this isn't some, those people who, speculate and buy and sell domain names. This is a little higher tier kind of speculation.
Yeah, it was interesting, but again, it's getting a top-level domain. It's actually a very good business because we have at .club now almost 1.5 million registrations, and it's a subscription business, meaning that when you register a domain name every year, you have to renew that registration. So it requires a lot of money up front to acquire the rights and then to launch it and market it. But once it's up and running and chugging along, if you have a good domain extension like we do with .club, it's actually a nice little business.
Well, as we enter our home stretch here, I want to get a little more personal.
Sure.
Take you back to, the Jeffrey Sass aspiring filmmaker from a couple decades ago. And I think to especially speak to, people listening who either want to be in the film industry or currently are maybe starting just out of film school. But I think when you start out, you see, people who act, direct, maybe screenwriters, but there's so much hidden in the film industry, the producing, all the different crafts, and just all the different, marketing and business sides, which it sounds like you got an exposure to with Satori early on with the distribution, and then Troma. I mean, do you ever regret not pursuing the directing, or did you kind of realize early on, you know what, I like this other side better, and maybe, I have a natural knack for it? What do you think about that whole, period of your career?
Yeah, it's a good question, Kelly, that I often, not too often, but once in a while will think of myself. And I have friends, that I started out with that have gone down, you know, all aspects, all different paths you could have gone down, back then. And I've always had an attitude of kind of just going with the flow. So I haven't had in my career a strict plan that I was going to follow. I'm very I enjoy doing different things, so I've been very opportunistic when I was, in the film industry and working for Troma. The reason I left Troma was to get into the video and computer game industry. I was always a bit of a computer nerd and kind of a geek, an early adopter, and those were the early days of interactive entertainment. And because of our licensing activities with Toxic Avenger and Reading Rainbow, I was doing deals with some of the game companies, including Sega and Nintendo, and a company in Florida called Game Tech had done a deal with us for Reading Rainbow. And I became fascinated with the convergence of interactive entertainment with traditional entertainment back in the early days of CD-ROM. And so ended up leaving Troma to go to work for that company, Game Tech, here in Florida, where I live now, to get involved in that industry. And so that was not part of any master plan. It was just kind of opportunistic and something that interested me. And I've followed that kind of a path throughout my career. Do I think back every once in a while, what would have been like if I had done this or done that? Sure. But those kinds of thoughts are somewhat fruitless because I didn't do that. I'm here today, and I might have gone to Hollywood and become a screenwriter or something out there and gotten hit by a truck too. So you don't know. I tend not to look backwards as much as I look forward. But what I do look back to is the learnings I've had in all of those experiences. In every turn, to me, your career is much more like a Beatles song. It's a long and winding road. And throughout that journey, you pick up tidbits that you carry with you, just like I've carried all these Troma experiences with me for 25 years. And I carry experiences from other businesses I've been involved with. So, no, I don't think much about it. I'm actually very happy with where I am today, personally and professionally. And that's all part of my experience and my story. And every new day is built upon those experiences. So, I'm fine. And I still keep a hand in, creative pursuits. One of the things that drew me to marketing throughout my career is a love for writing and creating, because as a marketer, that's what I do most of the time, whether it's, writing copy for an ad or marketing mumbo jumbo for a brochure or a flyer or a description of a new product. That still lets me flex my writing muscles, which I enjoy. I've wrote the book, which of course was a lot of fun. I have always at any given moment a novel and a screenplay that I'm toying with in the background. And through .club, we actually launched a startup incubator in Fort Lauderdale, Florida called Startups.club. And we've actually been working with a local production company to track the story of 7 different startups that are working out of our incubator. And so we're producing a little documentary on entrepreneurship and startups. So I've had my hand in that, which is, again, circling back more towards production and entertainment. So I've always managed to keep a toe in the water, so to speak, but I have no regrets. I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today if I had gone down a different path.
You remind me a little bit of Herschel Gordon Lewis, who, the classic, a gore film, some would say, almost, the creator of, the gore horror film, but who actually went on to become even more prolific as a marketer and a copywriter and teaching other people how to do that. So there is some precedent, and in some ways, the exploitation filmmakers were like, throwback to the old carnival barkers and the people who just got you excited over something.
Which,
And
by the way, is what an entrepreneur does today. One of the things that really drew me to write that book, or this book, I should say, at this time in my career when I'm very involved in startups and entrepreneurship, is the fact that the similarities between making a film, especially an independent film, and being an entrepreneur are remarkable. I mean, every filmmaker is an entrepreneur. They're doing everything a startup does. They're just doing it in a much more concentrated, focused period of time. So I love those similarities and see it every day.
what advice would you give to a young filmmaker who sets out wanting to be the next Quentin Tarantino, dips their toe in the water, maybe lucks out and works for a company like Troma, and discovers, hey, wow, I'm kind of good at marketing and I like it. But in their mind, it's so hard to let go of wanting to be the next big director. And I know a lot of people flounder because they can't quite let go of that one thing and fully commit to another. What would your advice be to them?
I think it sounds so trite, but you have to be honest with yourself and true to yourself. You have to be self-aware. You have to recognize truly what your strengths are, truly what your interests are. And if it truly is something that you can't shake, that you must find your way to be that next big director, then go for it. But know that you're doing that because that is honestly not a vision of what you think would be cool, or not something that someone else plopped into your head, but something that at your core is what you must do. Otherwise, go with the things that if you are honest with yourself and self-aware, you're good at and you enjoy, and you can still have aspects of those other dreams, so to speak, be a part of it. Like I said, if you like writing, there are lots of ways to write on a daily basis that don't involve being a Hollywood screenwriter. And there are lots of ways to get paid to write that don't involve being a Hollywood screenwriter. So you have to be self-aware and honest with yourself. I think first and foremost, and every day, life is too short. We live in a crazy world right now. We're in the midst of this, potential pandemic. The zombie apocalypse is coming. Who knows? Every day counts. You want to make every day matter, and chasing an unfulfilled dream that's not realistic sometimes is not the way to enjoy every day and make every day matter. So just make sure that whatever path you take, you're doing it for the right reasons, and you're doing it in a way where every day matters and you're happy every day.
Do you think it's an East Coast, West Coast thing? Here on the West Coast, we're so kind of new age, full of possibility, where I kind of envy with you guys, especially New Yorkers. You're so pragmatic. You cut your losses quick, you move on, you don't spend a lot of time moping around regretting things.
I don't know. I mean, East Coast, West Coast. I mean, I don't think in today's world, at least for me, I don't think of place so much anymore because we're all connected everywhere. I travel quite a bit. I've traveled around the world. I've been to China 14 times in the last 3.5 years. Place doesn't hold the same meaning to me as it did when I was younger. When I was in my 20s in New York, yeah, going to LA was a big deal. Today, a 5-hour cross-country flight doesn't feel like anything. It's insignificant. So I don't think it's necessary place. I think there are other things that affect.
Do you miss Times Square? Do you miss the whole myth around the old grindhouse theaters? Because a lot of people like me from, near Seattle, Washington, thought I missed out being able to see Toxic Avenger in a seedy grindhouse theater in Times Square. I know it's in our mind now. It doesn't exist anymore. But isn't there a part of you that wishes that still existed?
Yeah, it was certainly had it charming in its own sort of way. And when I go back to New York and to Times Square now, it's a little bit over the top with these characters getting the selfies and getting hit over the head with a selfie stick everywhere you turn. So yeah, I mean it's lost some of its charm in that it wasn't so overly commercial as it is today. So sure, there's something to be said for that. But hey, life goes on. We evolve. We evolve to a point where we have no attention span anymore, and we can't live without this device that connects us to the internet.
Well, final question. If you do write another book, which I hope you do, is it going to go further into marketing, or are you going to go deeper into your experiences working at Troma?
So, good question that I don't have a great answer for. In that, I have a bunch of different ideas that I've been pursuing. I like to, in general in life, alternate between fiction and nonfiction. So, like my reading patterns are typically I'll read a nonfiction book and then a novel and then a nonfiction book and a novel, and writing is similarly. So this book was a nonfiction book, and so now I'm actually working on a short novella that's much more in line with something that could have been a Troma movie, a little bit of a fun horror story set in the world of CrossFit gyms, believe it or not. So I'm playing with that at the moment. But I also had some thoughts of doing some more with the Everything I Know About concept. And whereas the first book was with the Toxic Avenger, there are other places I've been and experiences I've had that have also impacted my thoughts on business and marketing that I could tap into for a similarly anecdotal approach to sharing those lessons.
Okay, and a bonus question, because I just realized I had asked a colleague, I said, hey, I'm interviewing Jeffrey Sass, background in trauma. Do you have a question for him? So you get a guest question from Jay-Z Murdoch in Bremerton, Washington, who's also a screenwriter and writer. So he's no slouch. He's a smart guy. But what he wanted me to ask you was, what's it like to work with Lloyd Kaufman out in the field on a film shoot?
Well, it's changed. So when I started at Troma in 1987, it was horrific, to be honest. And I think I refer to it in the book. But the first Troma film I worked on was Troma's War, and they say war is hell, and it was. It was horrible. Screaming and yelling and ridiculous amounts of pressure for ridiculous reasons. And it got to the point where what the hell did I get myself into? And at one point I did actually quit and was kind of begged to stick it out and stay. And so it was pretty rough in the early days. But I will also have to say that, like a fine wine, over time, things aged and matured and fermented beautifully. In that, in later years, it was much more fun and much more enjoyable, and a lot of the yelling and screaming had so subsided, and working with Lloyd was a joy. And so we ended at that stage. It was like, March comes in like a lion and out like a lamb. So my experience at Troma came in like a lion and kind of went out like a lamb. So by the time I left in 1994, I was very happy working with Lloyd, and we remain, good friends to this day.
Which leads to, finally, what is the biggest takeaway, the best lesson you learned from working at Troma?
Oh gosh, I mean, there are so many. There are so many that I could pick out. So one I'll mention that's practical is, we did a lot of promotion for our movies. We appeared, we launched Up All Night on USA Network with Gilbert Gottfried, and in the interstitials, and I had the opportunity to make a lot of TV appearances and promotional appearances on behalf of Troma when we were promoting stuff. And Lloyd had once told me, that no matter what they ask or what they say, just make sure you mention Troma in the answer, right? Just always somehow work in Troma because that's what you're here to promote, and so they can ask you, what color is the sky? And I can say, the sky's blue, and it kind of reminds me of the blue in the back of the Troma logo. But I think actually for those of you who have the opportunity to speak on behalf of your company or your product or your service, it's important to remember, on the one hand, you don't want to, be selling and not listening. You want to listen to the interviewer and answer correctly. But by the same token, you want to recall what you're there for and cleverly and naturally find ways to mention as many times as you can the name of your company or the name of the product that you're trying to promote. And Troma was very good at that. And that was a very good lesson. And to this day, I always kind of remind myself of that before I have the opportunity to promote something and make sure I don't forget to mention .club or paw.com or whatever it is I'm there to talk about.
Well, I'm going to use that as a cue as we close to mention your book one more time. So here goes. It's a tongue twister. I encourage everyone to read and buy either a paper copy, a Kindle copy. Hopefully there's an audiobook copy. Is there an audio?
Actually, Kelly, I'm embarrassed to say I did not do the audiobook when I first published the book, and I intended to do it and started towards the end of last year, but didn't complete it. So one of my objectives for this year is to come out with the audiobook. Part of the reasons for the delay is I want to read it myself and share these stories, and I want to include some fun sound effects and other items that I have access to because of the Troma connection. And so I want to do it right, and so I have not rushed it, but hopefully this year you'll see the audiobook as well. But right now it is available in paperback and Kindle, as you mentioned.
Well, you'll be great at that because you have a great voice with an East Coast edge. So very authentic. So the book is called Marketing 101, Everything I Know About Business and Marketing I Learned from the Toxic Avenger, One Man's Journey to Hell's Kitchen and Back. His name is Jeffrey W. Sass, and I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Likewise, Kelly, I appreciate the detailed and in-depth questions, and I hope that your listeners will find something of value in there.
Ha ha ha!